I wonder if you've ever had any of that kind of morning. One of those mornings where you woke up to a day where you know that today is the day you have to do something you don't want to do. And you're not looking forward to it. And the knot in your stomach is larger than the courage in your heart. Our text begins the story by saying Abraham rose early in the morning. Only 2 times in the entire book of Genesis is that phrase used. The first time on the morning that Abraham must go and be asked to sacrifice his son Isaac. And the other time it was used is when Abraham had to get up and banish his son Ishmael that he had with Hagar from the family clan. Both times Abraham rose early in the morning. Both times Abraham set out with determination and faith that is sure as the rising sun. Because Genesis 22, the text that you heard today, is certainly going to test Abraham's faith. But we get ahead of ourselves. You remember a couple weeks ago we talked about the flood. And after the flood now, where we are in Genesis, God will come and now choose one specific person, Abraham, to now spread God's blessing to the entire world. You might think that after all the incidences with Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and the flood, that God might now choose an especially worthy or vetted or qualified or deserving person to fill the position. But nope. No resumes are collected, no references are contacted, no reality show competition is held, no ballots are cast. There is nothing special or noteworthy or deserving about this new chosen person, Abraham. He was just an ordinary guy full of faith and faults, as you can read about elsewhere before and after this story. God comes to Abraham out of nowhere and simply calls him and makes promises to him, because this is who God is, always giving life. God promises land and descendants and multitudes of descendants. He promises to bless Abraham and his children, and promises even more to bless the entire world through him, Abraham. God staked everything on Abraham. Will Abraham now stake everything on God? That gets us to the troubling story of Genesis 22. God sets up this especially elaborate, horrific test for Abraham. And this is the test. Abraham, do you really believe that God will provide? No matter what, can you hold on to my promise when I tell you Moriah? God will provide. That's the test. And God is pretty transparent about this, by the way. You heard in the text, God tells him flat out what he's going to do and what's going to happen. No smoke and mirrors here, no hidden agenda. God says, Abraham, I need you to go and sacrifice your one and only son, Isaac, whom you love. God instructs Abraham to take a 3-day journey. I don't know how in the world he slept for those 3 days. I wonder what he told Sarah. Honey, Isaac and I need to leave for 3 days. Did he make an excuse that they're going on a fishing weekend? I don't know. How do you do this? We do know that Abraham could have said, God, are you kidding me? No way. Waiting 90 years to have this kid was a test already. Thank you. I've already been tested. I think we're done in the test department. Having to banish my other son, Ishmael, that was another test. I think I passed that test too, Lord. And God, you promised to give me descendants that will outnumber the stars and the grains of the sands of the ocean. So this makes 0 sense to me that I should have to be tested again and that you would want me to sacrifice my one and only son. But inexplicably, Abraham doesn't say any of that. What we're told is that he dutifully packs the donkey, instructs the servants, packs the cooler, and sets out for what we think was about a 50-mile trek to this unknown and as of yet unnamed mountain. They arrive 3 days later at the foot of the mountain, and the tensions heighten as he tells the servants now that they are to stay behind. And he, now 100 years old, and his 18-year-old son climb up the mountain together. And along the way, the author gave us some really wonderful, colorful details. Abraham took the servants with him, but Abraham, not the servants, Abraham cut the sacrificial wood. Abraham tells the servants to stay behind because they, note the plural, Abraham and Isaac, they are going up the mountain to worship. And then did you notice too the plural? And they will return. Although Abraham cuts the wood, then he packs it on the back of Isaac, who has to carry the load up the mountain. They walk together, and several times the text underlines the closeness and intimacy of father and son as they walk and climb and talk together. They get to the top of the mountain, they build the pyre together. And then the other part of the story that just always slays me is that Isaac is bound and apparently is also obedient to get up on the altar. Here was a 100-year-old man who just climbed a mountain for 3 days. You think an 18-year-old could have outran him? Surely. But there's something in the story, too, here about the obedience of Isaac, who allows himself to be bound. And now that all of this is set up, at the very instant that God knows that Abraham has followed through and will surely follow through, just as Abraham is about to drop the knife, heaven opens and cries out, "Abraham, do not harm the boy, for I now know that you do fear God, that you trust me, and would not even withhold your one and only son." And then God provides, as he promised. There's a ram caught in the thicket. And God allows a substitution for he who should have been sacrificed. Something else is allowed to take its place. And so they named the place Moriah, because God will provide. Abraham's faith is tested, and he passes the test. "For now I know," God says, "that you fear me and trust me completely, and that you will obey me even when intellectually it makes no sense at all." It's a story about faith, and it's a story about testing. To see if Abraham can really believe God beyond what he can see, beyond what he can reason. And indeed, I think there really is no way to know what we believe, whether or not we do fear and trust and obey God completely, except that claim be tested. You know, it's not enough to read about faith. It's not enough to study faith. It's not enough to teach faith. It's not enough to pray for faith. It's not enough to write devotionals about faith. Finally, faith is a muscle that has to be exercised or it will atrophy. That's why it's called faith. That's why it's a verb. Just this past Monday, I had the delightful opportunity to have dinner with a young couple. They are Latino, and they just graduated from Calvin Theological Seminary. So over the salad course, I asked them to tell me the story about growing up in Mexico and all about their wonderful life there. Over the entree, I asked them to tell me the story of how they were called from Mexico, of all places, to Grand Rapids, Michigan, and how on earth they figured out how to enroll in our seminary, Calvin Theological Seminary. Over dessert, I said, "Okay, so I assume you're going back to Mexico. When do you leave and where you're going? And tell me about the church you've got lined up there." And they said, "Oh, we're not going back to Mexico." And I said, "You're not?" And I said, "Where are you going?" And they said, "We want to be missionaries in Belgium." And I said, "Belgium?" And they explained. They said their long-term goal is to be the people who support missionaries, who provide for missionaries. And they said, but as we were thinking about that call, how will we know how to best support missionaries? How will we know what missionaries need? How will we know what missionaries are going through if we ourselves haven't walked that path? So they said, what we did is we sat down and said, now where would be the most far out removed culture from the one we know? And we chose Belgium. And as coffee was served, they smiled and looked at me and said, we're learning to speak Flemish. If this isn't a test of faith, I don't know what is. You see, because at the end of the day, right, there's no other way to do it than to do it. And so it was with Abraham's faith, and so it is with yours and mine. It's not enough just to talk about it, to study it, to read it, to hash it out, to pray for it. For faith to be faith, you finally got to exercise it, because faith is a muscle. And there's no way to test how strong that muscle is except to use it. And your faith, like Abraham's, will be tested too. I've learned over the years as a pastor never to say, oh, I can't believe what you're going through, because I could never go through anything like that. Because I think God has a way of hearing those things and caring about us enough so much that he says, I'm going to show you that you can make it through something like that. It's that old spiritual that sings, if I never had a problem, I wouldn't know that God could solve them. So many of you in this sanctuary and you watching online have so much more authority on this than I do standing here. You know so much better than I do of how life can test your faith. And I know this because you have honored me by sharing your story with me. And what always strikes me about all the stories that I hear, the loneliness, the grief, the sickness, the loss, the addiction, life in a world gone haywire, what always strikes me is not the story, but the coda, the postlude to the story, the way the conversation ends. But you know what, Pastor? In spite of all of this, you'll never believe, looking back, I see how God provided. And I'm here today to tell you about this. Can you even believe that how bad this was, in the midst of it, God was so good? And I know that this could be one of those sermons where the Spirit takes my words and brings them to you in situations that I'm completely oblivious about, in ways that I cannot understand. The Spirit loves to do that. And I can't address the particulars of all the tests that all of you might be thinking about, or the tests you are experiencing, or the test you're worrying about. But what I can do confidently is give you 3 things that I want you to think about for whatever you're facing today. And I think it'll work in any and all situations. 3 brief little things, your take-homes. First, remember, you can't get from Mexico to Belgium without doing it. There's just no other way. You can't just talk about it. You got to do it. There's no substitution for actually trusting God and jumping in and doing what needs doing. There is no such thing as virtual faith. The only way to do it is to do it. Second, God will provide. I know some of you are in a situation where you can't believe this because it looks so awful intellectually, rationally. This makes no sense. The horizon is bleak. You don't understand it. The future is fuzzy. I'm telling you, God will provide. And for you, your mantra this week is the one word, Mariah. Third, every time you do steps 1 and 2, take the faith test and pass it, and experience the trustworthiness of God, you will be able to step out more and then experience even more the trustworthiness of God, and then step out more and more. In the faith business, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Now, why can I suggest those 3 take-homes so confidently? Because if you look up and out this morning, you'll see another hill. And you'll see another hill where the wood is carried up on the shoulders of the Son who is to be sacrificed. And there are 2 others with him. And they bind him, and they put him on an altar in the shape of a cross, a beloved Son of God. And God allows with that death a substitution to be made, in that his Son, the perfect Lamb of God, took your place, because God provides. You just can't read about faith. You just can't sit here and listen to a pretty nice sermon about faith. You just can't study it. You can't pray for it or talk about it. Finally, for faith to be faith, it's a muscle. It has to be exercised. Believing a hope against hope that God's promise is sure. Faith, God will test. Faith, God will provide. All those who heard this and believed said, amen.